This series is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is an awesome app that lets you learn real math and science in a hands-on way. They already have thousands of lessons and they're adding new exclusive content every single month. And you can get started for free by going to brilliant.org/ForrestValkai or using the link in the description below. If you're a lifelong learner like me, then Brilliant is the app for you. Brilliant offers college-level content for absolutely everybody to help you become a better learner and a better thinker as well. You'll learn to solve all sorts of problems and understand things in a totally new way as you blaze your way through fun, bite-sized lessons that help keep your brain active and engaged every single day. So keep exploring at brilliant.org/ForrestValkai. Get started for free and hurry because the first 200 people get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks so much to Brilliant for sponsoring this series. Now let's learn science. Life on Earth is extraordinarily diverse. More than 1.3 million species have been identified so far, and there are an estimated several million more still out there, just waiting to be discovered. Even just the species that we know of show a glorious amount of variability. The blue whale, for example, is the largest animal on Earth. They can reach lengths of almost 30 meters or 98 feet and weigh as much as 150,000 kilograms or 330,000 pounds. A virus, on the other hand, is remarkably small. Most measure in at just around 100 or so nanometers across. That's over 1,000 times smaller than the width of a human hair, and over 10 billion times smaller than the length of a blue whale. How can two things that are this different in nature be explained by the same theory? Viruses aren't even technically alive, so how can we understand them and whales alike by using just one model? That is the power of evolution. Without it, biology is just a pile of random facts which may seem interesting on their own, but make no meaningful picture as a whole. But with it, biology becomes perhaps the most intellectually satisfying and deeply inspiring science of them all. The study of evolution helps us stop the spread of disease, grow bigger and more nutritious crops, take care of the ecosystems around us, and make sense of the natural world. It allows us to reach hundreds of millions of years into the past and trace a line to the present. It helps us to understand where we came from, where we're going, and how literally all life on Earth is connected both to each other and to the rest of the universe. My name is Forrest Valkai. I've been studying evolution for a long time. And over the course of this series, I'm going to help you understand a little bit about how evolution works and how it informs all of biology, from exploring life's simplest molecules to analyzing whole ecosystems. Because as the great biologist Theodosius Davsansky once said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Whales, dolphins, and porpoises are all classified together in an order that we call Cetacea. There are about 90 different species of cetaceans in the world, and superficially, they look a lot like fish, with their streamlined bodies and their broad, flat tails. But if you look a little bit deeper, you'll see that they are, in fact, mammals. They have fur, they lactate, they give birth to live young. But if you look even deeper than that, and I mean like really literally deeper, you'll see that they also have hip and hind leg bones embedded deep inside their bodies. Now, how could that possibly make any sense? These animals spend their whole lives swimming. They don't even have hind legs, so why on earth would they need bones there? They don't. Anymore. Cetaceans evolved from animals that walked on land. Their hip and leg bones are just leftovers from that evolutionary history. Looking back over the fossil record, we can see a long transition from Indohyus to Pachycetus, to Ambulocetus, to Cuchucetus, to Durodon, and then finally to modern whales. Look again at that transition. Watch how those back legs get smaller and smaller. Watch how the nostrils slide back on the skull until they reach their modern position. Lots of whales have two blowholes that are just like your nostrils, but even dolphins, which only have one blowhole, still have two nasal passages in their skulls. And most importantly, Notice how every single one of those fossils is an intermediary step. None of those animals are half of a whale. None of those animals tried to swim a little bit deeper or hold their breath a little bit longer until they evolved into a whale out of sheer willpower. These fossils are snapshots that give us glimpses into a process that took around 50 million years. Each generation in this lineage fit into their ecological niche and lived in their environment just like any other animal would, starting with Untitled, just catching fish in the shallow waters along the shoreline. The ones who were able to move through the water better caught more food, which meant they had more energy, which meant they could have more babies. And after millions and millions of years of better swimmers and better food catchers, we eventually end up with animals like Homologous, who had those long snouts full of sharp teeth for catching fish, just like crocodilians. Long fingers and toes that were almost certainly webbed, just like an otter's. Longer and broader tails for propulsion, just like sharks, until eventually the front legs were used for steering, sort of like a fish's pectoral fins, and the back legs were effectively useless. Just look at Durodon. It had that super thick tail for swimming. It didn't need those tiny little back legs. It certainly wasn't going to be able to walk on them, and compared to the tail, they weren't doing much for propulsion. So the Durodons whose bodies didn't invest energy into growing those back legs had a survival advantage, because that energy could be better spent somewhere else. Plus, those useless little back legs were no longer a liability that could get damaged or infected. That means that they were better suited for their environment, so they had lots of babies which inherited their legless DNA, and this process continued over and over and over until eventually all the back legs were gone, and now we have cetaceans. And again, remember, these fossils are just snapshots of that timeline. Every single animal in this lineage is an evolutionary step. So it's not like there were just a bunch of Ambulocetuses hanging around and then they all gave birth to Durodons and died. That's not how evolution works. It's a gradient, not a stepladder. And there's a couple of other interesting things you can notice about whales as well, like how certain bones in modern whales look very, very similar to those found in bats and chickens and turtles and frogs and cats and even humans. If you look at the front limbs of any one of those species, you'll see one big bone here, then two bones, then a bunch of little wrist bones, and then some long finger bones. And this one bones, two bones, little bones, long bones pattern is so ubiquitous across all of these different animals because we all share a common ancestor that was also structured this way. We call these shared inherited characteristics homologous traits, and we'll talk a lot more about them in episode 2. Another thing to notice is that as smooth as that transition from land animal to sea animal might have looked in the fossil record, I left a lot of other fossils out, like Georgocetus, Protocetus, Myocetus, and when you sort all of those fossils in among the other ones, they tell an even more complete story. There are also several other lines of evidence that all come together to form our understanding of cetacean evolution. For example, cetacean embryos still grow little hind limb buds that get reabsorbed later on in development. We can also measure the ratios of stable oxygen isotopes in these fossils to show their transition from life in freshwater to life in saltwater over millions of years. And there's also other important bones, like the astragalus, which you find in animals like Untitled and Pakicetus, and which has the exact same double-pulleyed structure as the astragalus bones of modern artiodactyls, showing that whales come from the same group of animals that later evolved into things like cows and deer. And I haven't covered any of that stuff in great detail because this is the first episode and I don't want to get too complicated, but if I'm being honest, I don't have to, because you can just look at the fossil record and literally watch evolution happening right in front of you. Now, if this is your first time learning about evolution, you probably have a ton of questions by this point, so let's go through some of the most common ones. First and foremost, how do we know that these fossils are actually showing whale evolution? How do we know how old they are, or that they actually lived in the order that I described? To answer that question, we would use radiometric dating to either get the ages of the fossils themselves or of the rocks and other materials around them. That would tell us exactly how old these organisms are and allow us to put them in order. But even if that didn't work and we had no idea how old these fossils were, we still find them in different layers of geological strata, and they never cross between them. You never find an Untitled up amongst the Durodons or vice versa. those rock layers take millions of years to deposit, and because of the law of superpositioning, one of the foundational principles of geology, we know that younger rock layers are deposited on top of older rock layers. So if we find different fossils in different layers, we immediately know which one came first. So that's two different dating methods, one relative dating method called biostratigraphic dating, and one absolute dating method called radiometric dating, both of which overlap to show us the exact ages and orders of these fossils. Another question, how do we know that the animals represented by these fossils are related to each other? What if they're all just totally different animals that just happen to appear in that order? Biologists are trained to read certain bone markers that tell us a lot about what an animal is and what it's related to, like the astragalus bone that we talked about earlier. Just by seeing a couple of bones, or maybe even just one, we're able to learn quite a bit about what an animal is, what its family tree looks like, what its environment was, and even its behaviors. But even if we couldn't do that, even if all we knew for sure was that these are the skeletal remains of some animals that lived at one time and now don't anymore, that still tells us a lot. Namely, it proves that different kinds of animals lived over the course of Earth's history. And we already know that when you line all these animals up, they show a clear transition from one kind of animal to another. Logic alone points us towards evolution here. Another question. How can we make all of these assumptions with just a few fossils? What if these fossils are actually just the freakiest, most deformed fish in the history of the world, and they don't actually show evolution? The simple truth is, we have warehouses full of fossils from millions of species across billions of years. Some of them, like the fossils of small marine life, are so incredibly abundant that you can buy them in gift shops or just go find them pretty much anywhere in the world. Here I got a whole seashell full of them. This is a little clam, and this is called a cryonoid, that's a type of echinoderm, and this is a shark's tooth, and this one is a stingray tooth, and this little snail. This is some fossilized coral, this is called a zipper oyster, this guy's a trilobite. Right here behind me on this shelf is a fossilized bison vertebra from right here in Oklahoma. And the most important thing to remember about fossils is that it is extremely difficult for them to form. The circumstances for fossilization to take place are very, very, very specific. So if we find even one fossil of one particular organism, it's pretty safe to assume that there were at least thousands and thousands of those things living at that one particular time for even one of them to go through the unbelievably unlikely scenario of becoming a fossil. And if we find several fossils of that one kind of organism, as it is with pretty much every step of cetacean evolution, those chances just go higher and higher and higher. But what if we completely throw out all of that? What if we decide that none of that is actually evidence for anything? The radiometric date means nothing, the bone markings mean nothing, the order of the fossils means nothing, none of it means anything, and all we know for sure is that at some point over the course of this planet's history, there were other animals that existed for no reason. One day there was an Indohyus, and the next day there was a whale, and that's just how it is. Well, believe it or not, in that incredibly silly situation, there would still be a clear pathway to the truth, which is genetic testing. Yet another line of evidence for evolution, which shows that the closest living animal relative to modern cetaceans is the hippopotamus, which is an artiodactyl, and the only way that makes sense is if cetaceans and artiodactyls share a common ancestor, like we talked about earlier. By the way, we're going to talk about all the lines of evidence that I've mentioned so far in much greater detail in episode 2, so stay tuned for that. Now, before we talk about evolution any further, it's probably a good idea that you know what evolution actually is and how it works at its most fundamental level. And for that, you only really need to know 3 things. Number 1, you need to understand genes. DNA is the code for life. It's broken up into several sections called genes. Each gene codes for a different thing. And when reproduction occurs, these genes are passed on from parent to offspring. Number 2 is that different versions of these genes exist, which we call alleles. Think about your parents. You probably don't look exactly like either one of them. Rather, you look like a blend of both of them. This is because there isn't just one allele for hair color, or eye color, or skin color, or height, or anything else. There's lots and lots of them. And some of those alleles express more than others. Some of them express less than others. Sometimes different alleles can kind of express at the same time. And finally, number 3. Different alleles are better suited for life in different environments. You could have all the best alleles for living in a coral reef, and they're not going to do you a bit of good if you're living in the outback. The best boa constrictor is going to die in Antarctica, and the best penguin is going to die in the Amazon. If you can understand these 3 simple axioms, you can understand the basics of evolution. Different alleles get passed on from parent to offspring. If those alleles benefit the offspring, they're going to have lots of offspring of their own and pass on those beneficial alleles. And if they don't, then they won't, and those alleles will die out. Either way, we're talking about the exact same thing: changing the total genetic makeup of an entire population. From generation to generation to generation, the frequency at which we see different alleles appear amongst all the individuals of one species in one area starts to shift. And I promise you, if you can understand that, if you can wrap your head around the idea of changing the heritable traits of a population across multiple generations, you can understand evolution. And why am I so sure about that? Because that's the actual definition of evolution. Any change in the heritable traits of a population across multiple generations. That is what evolution is. And notice the specific wording of that definition. I said heritable traits. That does not necessarily mean DNA. In fact, we're going to talk about other non-genetic factors of evolution in episode 3. Notice that I said population. Individuals don't evolve. An organism doesn't just magically turn into another kind of organism. The whole population slowly changes across several generations as the average traits amongst them starts to shift. Also notice that I said any change. There is no good or bad in evolution because there is no plan or end goal in mind. It's just about reproduction. A great example of this principle would be blind cave animals, like the Mexican blind cave fish. Normally, having a mutation that would destroy your eyes would be a pretty bad thing, but when you're living your entire life in total darkness, what's actually harmful is spending a bunch of energy developing eyes that you're never going to use, but that could get damaged or infected later on. So in this very specific situation, losing your eyes was actually a beneficial adaptation. And this is a super important thing to understand about evolution. It is entirely dependent on the environment in which a population is living. If there was a population of bears living in a very cold environment, and that environment was getting warmer and warmer and warmer, then having shorter hair and less body fat would be beneficial adaptations for that population, even though those would have been harmful adaptations back in their original environment. When you gain fitness in one environment, you lose fitness in another environment. Everything is relative. There is no perfect organism. There is no peak of evolution. And at this point, you're probably asking, but if all we're doing is shuffling around alleles, then how do new traits appear? How do new species evolve with old DNA? And I'm actually really happy that you asked that question because that's exactly where I was going next. Let's talk about viruses. There are lots of different kinds of viruses. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Some are enveloped in a plasma membrane, some are not. Some infect plants, some infect animals, some even infect bacteria. The one thing that unifies viruses is that they all contain genetic material. But even there's a lot of diversity. In fact, there are different classes of viruses based on what genetic material they have and how they use it. As incredibly varied as viruses are, they all do the same thing. They invade a host cell, they take control of the tiny machinery that the cell uses to make proteins and to copy its DNA, and then they force the cell to make thousands of copies of themselves, which then go to other cells to start the cycle over again. The key here is that not all of these new viruses are perfect copies of the original. Occasionally, the viral genome gets copied incorrectly. I mean, imagine if you had to copy an entire book by hand thousands of times. You might get lucky and get it right a couple of times, but you're bound to make more than a few mistakes. These little mistakes, which we call mutations, mean that these new viruses have slightly different alleles than the originals. Differences in genetics is what leads to the evolution of new strains of a virus, and because they replicate so incredibly fast, we can see that evolution in rapid time. Take a look at this graph showing the H1N1 virus from 2008 as it diversifies from one strain into several dozen strains in just a few months. And notice how this family tree looks a lot like the one that whales have, but that one took 50 million years. Remember, evolution is constrained by reproduction. It can only happen as fast as a species can reproduce. Whales take years to reach sexual maturity, and some species can gestate a baby for over a year. So it's no wonder why viruses evolve faster when they can make tens of thousands of copies of themselves in just a matter of hours. The key thing to remember here is that these little mutations can have big ramifications, and there's lots of different ways in which they can happen. Let's do a quick refresher on genes. I mentioned before that a gene is just a chunk of DNA that codes for a particular thing. Your DNA is made up of long sequences of 4 bases, which you can think of as like letters to the language of your genome. The average human gene is around 20,000 letters long, but there are some genes that have over 2 million letters in them. A gene is expressed in 2 steps. First is transcription, where the bases of a gene are read to make a little memo called mRNA. The second is translation, where that mRNA is read in 3-letter sequences called codons, with each codon coding for an amino acid, and those amino acids assembling to make a protein. A blue whale's genome contains over 30,000 protein-coding genes. An influenza virus has just 13. Now, back to mutations. The simplest kind of mutation is called a point mutation. This is where just one letter of your genetic code gets deleted, added, or switched around for another letter. This type of mutation could be silent, meaning it has no effect because the resulting codon codes for the same amino acid as before, or this single letter change could be a missense mutation, meaning that the new codon codes for a different amino acid, which could radically change the resulting protein, and this new protein structure could be beneficial, or it could be detrimental, or it could not matter at all. Or that single letter change could be what's called a nonsense mutation, meaning it creates a stop codon, a codon that stops protein production. So now you've only got what little bit of protein you had, and all the rest of the protein never gets built, and this new protein could have a totally new function now. And that could be beneficial, or it could be detrimental, or it could make no real difference. Or the new protein could be rendered completely functionless, and that could be beneficial, or it could be detrimental, or it could make no real difference. Some genes are also pleiotropic, meaning that even though they only code for one thing, they have a wide variety of different effects. For example, frizzle chickens have a dominant allele that causes all of their feathers to curl up, but that one single allele also causes them to have abnormal body temperatures and very high metabolic rates and very low egg production. So a single point mutation on one of those genes could have a bunch of different effects beyond just changing one single protein. Point mutations are responsible for albinism, polydactyly, fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, Gregg cephalopolysydactyly, Hutchinson-Gilford progeria, different kinds of color blindness, and a variety of other conditions. Those are all the result of point mutations, one single letter being out of place. Another type of mutation is a deletion event, where a chunk of DNA just doesn't get copied and is lost forever. Then there's inversion events, where a chunk of DNA gets copied backwards. Codons are only read in one direction, so that fundamentally changes the protein being made. Then there's duplication events, where a chunk of DNA gets copied twice. That leaves double the room for further mutation in the future. If the whole gene is duplicated, it could be expressed twice as much, or your body might automatically shut one of them off. If just part of the gene is duplicated, the resulting protein would have an extra chunk somewhere in the middle, and that could totally change the way that protein behaves. There are also translocation events, where a chunk of DNA from one chromosome gets swapped out with another chunk from a completely different chromosome. And there are even events where whole chromosomes can fuse together. And all of this is just talking about mutations to the gene itself. Just upstream of the gene is an area called the gene control region. That is a sequence of DNA that controls how and if a gene is expressed. For example, there's the promoter, which is where the whole process of transcription begins, so it's pretty important. Then there are enhancer sequences, where proteins called transcription factors bind to amplify the expression of a gene. Then there are silencer sequences, where other proteins called repressors bind to stop the expression of a gene. Imagine how powerful a mutation on any one of those points could be. And let's not forget the fact that those regulatory proteins are themselves coded for by other genes. So a mutation over there could affect the expression of several other unrelated genes. And on top of all of this, there are frame shift mutations, which is where the DNA code largely stays the same, but the order and sequence in which it is read changes. Because remember, it's read in groups of 3 letters, so imagine that you had a sentence, but every single letter was just shifted one space to the left. Would this make any sense to you? This all may sound pretty scary, but remember, mutations can be beneficial, or they can be detrimental, or as we would call it, deleterious, or they can do nothing at all. You have a few hundred mutations in your DNA, and so does everybody else who was ever born. A beneficial mutation helps the organism that carries it to survive and reproduce, maybe by making it easier to catch food or attract a mate. A deleterious mutation makes it more difficult for an organism to survive and reproduce, maybe by making it sterile or causing a physical deformity. A silent mutation has no observable effects, but those can stack up to become something big in the future. But remember, most mutations are tiny little changes, and the minute benefit or detriment that they provide is something that we only see played out on a population level over several generations. All this talk of randomness sometimes causes people to assume that evolution must also be random, but that's not exactly true. Natural selection is the non-random selection of random mutations. Random mutations happen all the time, but if they're beneficial, they're going to cause more reproduction, so that random mutation will spread throughout the population. Whereas if they're detrimental, they're going to limit or stop reproduction, so that mutation is going to be phased out and lost. This is also why we haven't evolved our way out of things like tooth decay or baldness or stiff joints. These are things that usually affect people who are well past standard reproductive age. So there's not a lot of selection pressure for them because evolution doesn't care what happens after you've already reproduced. If our species hit our physical and reproductive primes in our 60s and 70s rather than our teens and 20s, then things might be different. But we don't, so they're not. In the case of the virus, a mutation that allows it to spread more easily and make more and more copies of itself will quickly become the dominant mutation in the population and may even make a new strain of that virus. Whereas a mutation that hinders the virus's ability to spread will quickly be outcompeted by all the other viruses, meaning this strain will die off. Non-random selection of random mutations. The mutations are random, but the selection pressure provided by the environment is not. But wouldn't this mean that viruses are always getting weaker and that each new strain was less deadly than the last so that they had a better chance to spread? Sometimes, but not necessarily. Remember, the name of the game in evolution is reproduction. If a virus can make tons of copies of itself, it doesn't matter if it kills its host in the process or leaves the host with lifelong permanent damage. As long as it can spread, it's fine. Sure, keeping the host alive for a long time so it can spread further is ideal in some situations, and there are some viruses that use that strategy. But there are lots of them that don't, and there are plenty of examples of viruses that got more and more deadly with each new strain. And you can see this in several species of parasites as well. Malaria doesn't care if it kills you, it just wants to get to the next mosquito. Tapeworms don't care if you die of malnourishment, they just want to lay eggs, and your intestines are a nice warm place to do it. The point is, every single time a virus infects a new host, it makes millions of copies of itself. Every one of those copies has a chance for a mutation. Any one of those mutations could be beneficial, and if a virus has a beneficial mutation, it'll spread farther and faster and outcompete all the rest of the viruses, becoming the dominant strain, changing the heritable traits of the population over the course of multiple generations. And more or less the same step-by-step play is true for every other organism. Every single time a worm or a tree or a shark or a mushroom or a human reproduces and passes on its DNA, there's a chance that that DNA will be mutated in a way that improves the offspring's chances of survival and reproduction. Whether we're talking about whales or viruses, the same rules apply. Genes are passed from parent to offspring. Genes come in different varieties called alleles, and different alleles are differently suited for life in different environments. And if you can understand that, then you are well on your way to understanding evolution. We're going to go into a bunch more detail about pretty much everything I talked about today as this series progresses, but for right now, I think we've covered enough. Thank you so much for watching, liking, commenting, subscribing, and all the other stuff you do here on YouTube. I'm Forrest Valkai. Have an awesome rest of your day, and never stop learning. Bye-bye!